The alarm went off at 4:47 in the morning on Saturday, September 6, 2014, and Daniel Hargrove reached across the nightstand and silenced it before it could wake his wife. He had set it that early deliberately, not out of anxiety, but out of the particular species of eagerness that belongs to people who are genuinely happy doing what they do. He had been lying half awake for 20 minutes already, listening to the silence of the house in Anchorage, to the familiar creak of the water heater at the end of the hallway, to the long, slow breathing of Ellen beside him. He did not want to leave. He always felt this way at the start of a trip, the pull of two things he loved pressing in opposite directions. Daniel Hargrove was 34 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a civil consulting firm in Midtown Anchorage. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall, lean in the way that only people who move through wild terrain regularly ever get lean. Not the cultivated leanness of a gym, but the functional reduction of a body that has learned to carry its own weight across difficult ground. He had dark brown hair that he kept short on the sides and longer on top, a habit left over from his college years that he had never bothered to change. He wore the beginning of a beard by the end of every week because he tended to forget to shave. His colleagues described him as methodical. His wife described him as stubborn in exactly the right way. His younger brother Marcus, who lived in Fairbanks and had introduced Daniel to backcountry hiking in the first place, described him as the most prepared person he had ever met in the field and the most dangerously willing to push the limits of that preparation. Ellen stirred when he got out of bed, and he touched her shoulder gently in the dark. "Don't forget to call me from the trailhead," she said. She did not open her eyes. He had heard her say some version of this sentence before every solo trip for the 11 years they had been together. "I will," he said. He meant it. He always meant it. The kitchen light was the only light in the house at 4:52 in the morning when he drank his first coffee standing at the counter, reviewing the checklist he had printed 2 days earlier and folded into quarters in the front pocket of his fleece. He had been planning this particular trip for 6 weeks. The destination was the Scolai Pass Corridor in Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve, the largest national park in the United States, larger than the entire country of Switzerland, a place that consumed the southeastern corner of Alaska in a mass of peaks, glaciers, braided rivers, and tundra so vast that the Park Service itself acknowledged it could not meaningfully patrol more than a fraction of its interior. Daniel had completed 2 previous trips into the park's backcountry, a 4-day route along the Chittistone Drainage in 2011 and a longer traverse near the Nebezna Road corridor in 2012. He knew what the park was. He respected it in the specific technical way that experienced backcountry travelers learn to respect places that will kill you without any particular malice, simply because you made one poor decision and the terrain had no capacity for forgiveness. The gear spread across the living room floor had taken him 4 evenings to select and pack: a 65-liter Arc'teryx Bora pack, a Mountain Hardwear Phantom 32-degree sleeping bag, chosen because September temperatures in the Wrangell Ranges could drop well below freezing at elevation, a Big Agnes tent, 3 seasons, but reinforced with guy lines he had added himself. His Garmin InReach satellite communicator, fully charged, with the emergency contact list updated to include Ellen's cell, Marcus's cell, and the Kennecott Field Ranger Station number. A 3-day food supply of freeze-dried meals, supplemented with high-calorie trail bars, and 2 pounds of jerky he had made himself from caribou meat. A first aid kit that included a SAM splint, a compression bandage, a tourniquet, and a course of antibiotics his doctor had prescribed for exactly this kind of remote travel. He carried a bear canister as required by park regulations. He carried 2 liters of water in a Hydropack reservoir and 2 Nalgene bottles as backup. He carried a folding saw, a full-tang fixed-blade knife in a belt sheath, and a Bic lighter sealed in a Ziploc bag alongside a small tin of petroleum jelly-soaked cotton balls for fire starting in wet conditions. By the standards of the people who manage risk for a living, Daniel Hargrove was not reckless. He was, if anything, conservative. The kind of hiker who over-prepares because he has seen what under-preparation looks like and found the image instructive. His planned itinerary was straightforward. He would drive his 2009 Toyota Tacoma from Anchorage to the small community of McCarthy, a distance of approximately 310 miles, arriving by early afternoon. From McCarthy, he would hike into the backcountry via an established route toward the Nizina River drainage, camp for 2 nights near the base of the Skolai Pass approach, explore the upper valley on the 3rd day, and return to his truck by the morning of Tuesday, September 9th. He had filed a backcountry itinerary with the Wrangell-St. Elias Visitor Center and Copper Center, where a ranger named Patricia Wells had reviewed his plan and stamped it into the log at 10:14 in the morning on Friday, September 5th, the day before his departure. "Looks well thought out," Ranger Wells had told him, sliding the carbon copy across the counter. "Weather window looks decent through Sunday, but watch for afternoon convective activity on Monday. Things can build fast in the Skolai corridor." "I'll be watching," Daniel said. He took the copy, folded it, and placed it in the same pocket as his checklist. At 5:23 in the morning on September 6th, he loaded the last of his gear into the Tacoma's bed and went back inside to find Ellen standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe with a second cup of coffee already made. "I thought you were asleep," he said. "I was watching you load the truck," she said. They stood together in the kitchen for 11 minutes, not speaking very much. She straightened the collar of his jacket twice, even though it did not need straightening. He told her he would call from the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. He told her he loved her. He kissed her once on the forehead and once on the mouth. He pulled out of the driveway at 5:34 in the morning. The drive southeast on the Glen Highway was quiet in the pre-dawn dark, the headlights cutting through the low ground fog that settled in the Matanuska Valley at this time of year. By the time he reached the Glen Allen Junction, the sky had lightened to a flat gray that promised a clear day behind it. He stopped at the Glen Allen gas station at 8:19 in the morning, filled the tank, bought a canned coffee from the cooler by the door, and used the restroom. The attendant, a teenage boy with red hair and a Carhartt hooded sweatshirt, remembered him later, remembered specifically that he had nodded, paid in cash, and asked whether the road toward Chitina was clear. The attendant had said it was. Daniel had thanked him, dropped $23 on the counter, and walked back to his truck. He parked the Tacoma in the established day-use lot at the McCarthy Road trailhead terminus at 1:58 in the afternoon, 6 minutes ahead of the time he had estimated to Ellen when he mapped the route the week before. He sat in the cab for a moment after the engine went quiet, eating the last of a granola bar and looking out through the windshield at the mountains, which stood in a wall of jagged white above the tree line, their peaks catching the afternoon light with an indifferent brilliance. He called Ellen at 2:04 in the afternoon. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. According to her phone records obtained later, she told him to be careful. He told her the weather looked perfect. He said he would check in on the inReach that evening from camp and would call again Tuesday morning from the road. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he said. Those were the last words Ellen Hargrove heard from her husband for 341 days. At 2:17 in the afternoon, a trail camera mounted on a wooden post at the park boundary captured a still image of Daniel Hargrove adjusting the straps of his pack at the edge of the trailhead. In the image, he is looking down at something near his chest, probably the inReach, probably checking that it was powered on. His posture is relaxed. His gait, in the 3 seconds of buffer captured before and after the frame, is easy and deliberate. He looks like a man beginning something he has done before and looks forward to doing again. He walked north and east into the trees, and the wilderness swallowed him whole. Ellen Hargrove did not immediately panic when Tuesday morning came and went without a call. Daniel had been late checking in before. The inReach had failed to transmit twice on his 2012 Nabesna trip. A satellite coverage gap in that particular valley, he had explained afterward, tracing it on a coverage map with his finger. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She was a pediatric occupational therapist and had spent her professional life learning to stay calm in the presence of distress so that children in distress could take their cues from her. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, September 9th, she had not heard from him. She called his cell phone. No service, which was expected. She opened the inReach app on her phone and looked at the tracking history. The device had last transmitted a position fix at 11:42 in the morning on Sunday, September 7th, placing him approximately 4.1 miles northeast of his departure point at an elevation of 3,200 feet near the lower approach to the Skolai Pass corridor. After that, nothing. She called the Wrangell-St. Elias Visitor Center and Copper Center at 3:47 in the afternoon. The ranger on duty, a 28-year-old seasonal employee named Garrett Foss, who had worked 2 seasons at the park and had handled 4 previous overdue hiker reports, took down her information carefully and told her that they would initiate a preliminary check. He retrieved the itinerary Daniel had filed on September 5th and confirmed that the last known position from the inReach was consistent with Daniel's planned route. He told Ellen that hikers running a day late in the backcountry were not unusual, particularly given variable terrain and weather, and that they would continue monitoring and would contact the Alaska State Troopers and Alaska Air National Guard Rescue Coordination Center if Daniel had not returned or made contact by 8 o'clock that evening. He had not. At 8:17 in the evening on September 9th, Garrett Foss filed a formal overdue person report with the Alaska State Troopers Detachment in Glen Allen. The investigation number assigned was AST 2014-UC-0937. The formal search began at first light on Wednesday, September 10th. The logistics of searching for a missing person in Wrangell-St. Elias National Park are not comparable to the logistics of searching for a missing person in any other landscape in the contiguous United States, or in most of the world. The park encompasses 13.2 million acres. Its interior contains no roads beyond the single unpaved route to McCarthy. Communication is restricted to satellite-dependent systems in most of the backcountry. The terrain shifts without warning from river gravel bars to canyon walls to glacial moraine to tundra plateau, and the weather systems that move through the Wrangell Mountains in September can ground aviation assets for days at a time. The search operation that assembled in the early hours of September 10th was managed out of a temporary command post established in the NPS maintenance compound near Kennecott, coordinated jointly by the National Park Service, the Alaska State Troopers, and the Alaska Army National Guard. The incident commander was NPS Search and Rescue Coordinator Franklin Becht, a compact, quiet man of 51 who had managed backcountry search operations in Alaska for 19 years and who wore his hair in a flat gray crew cut that made him look, one of the Alaska Dispatch news photographers noted later, like an aircraft carrier captain who had seen his share of difficult weather. By 7 o'clock in the morning on September 10th, the following assets were deployed or en route. 2 Bell 407 helicopters from the Alaska Army National Guard's 1-207th Aviation Battalion out of Fort Wainwright, equipped with FLIR thermal imaging systems. 1 NPS fixed-wing Cessna 206 for aerial grid search. A ground team of 4 experienced backcountry rangers who would travel the known route on foot, and a mutual aid team from the Mountain Rescue Association's Anchorage chapter. 6 volunteers, including 3 certified wilderness medical technicians, who arrived at the Kennecott staging area in 2 vehicles at 9:31 in the morning. The weather on September 10th cooperated conditionally. The ceiling held above 4,000 feet through the morning, giving the helicopters adequate working altitude over the lower Skolai approach. By early afternoon, high clouds had moved in from the southwest, and the ceiling had dropped to 2,200 feet, forcing the aircraft to operate below the ridgeline and significantly reducing their effective search coverage. The ground team, led by Ranger Donna Akatsu, a 37-year-old former mountaineer guide from Valdez, who had been with the Park Service for 8 years and who carried a calm, methodical energy that her colleagues described as almost geological in its steadiness, departed the trailhead at 6:48 in the morning following Daniel's recorded route. By 11:15, they had reached the last confirmed GPS position of the inReach device, at 3,200 feet on the lower slope above the Nizina drainage. The terrain at that point was a mix of late-season tundra, broken rock, and the first scatterings of the coniferous trees that gave way to alpine scrub above the tree line. The vegetation showed no sign of disturbance consistent with a fall or impact. No broken branches, no displaced rocks, no blood. The ground team photographed everything and pressed on. Ellen Hargrove had driven to Kennecott the evening before, arriving at the makeshift command post at 11 o'clock at night and sitting across from Franklin Becht in the bright fluorescent light of the maintenance office while he walked her through the search plan. Her younger sister Carolyn had come with her and sat at her side, a hand on Ellen's forearm. Becht, who had delivered this kind of briefing to frightened families perhaps 200 times in his career, described what they knew, what they were doing, and what scenarios they were considering, in the measured cadence of a person who had learned long ago that the families of missing persons need information more than they need reassurance. He was well equipped, Becht told her. The equipment list you provided is consistent with what he filed with us. A man with his experience and his kit has significantly more margin than most people who come into this park. That matters." Ellen nodded. She did not cry. Not that night. She sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and asked quiet, technical questions about the search grid and the weather forecast and whether the thermal imaging was effective in forested terrain. The break, the single piece of physical evidence that the entire search would yield, came at 2:47 in the afternoon on September 11th. Ranger Akatsu's ground team, working the upper tundra bench above a dry creek drainage approximately 5.8 miles from the trailhead, found Daniel Hargrove's bare canister. It was lodged in a cleft between two boulders at the edge of a scree field, wedged as though it had fallen from above and come to rest there by chance rather than by placement. The canister was intact, the lid was closed, and inside it were two remaining freeze-dried meal pouches, a small coil of paracord, and a folded piece of blue moleskin paper, half of a torn page from what appeared to be a field journal, on which someone had written 3 words in black pen. The words were, "Followed the water." The handwriting matched the handwriting on the itinerary Daniel Hargrove had filed with the Park Service. Donna Akatsu held the paper in gloved hands for a long moment before placing it in an evidence bag. She photographed the canister in situ, photographed the surrounding terrain, and called into the command post on her satellite communicator at 2:53 in the afternoon. Franklin Becht received the information, noted it in the incident log, and stared at the topographic map spread across the table in front of him. Followed the water. In the Skolai drainage, water ran predominantly east and then north toward the Nizina confluence. It also ran west down the back slope of the pass in a dozen smaller tributaries, some of which emptied into braided channels that merged with the White River system deeper in the park's interior, terrain so remote that a ground team would need multiple days to reach it on foot, and aviation access would depend entirely on weather. The search expanded accordingly. Over the next 4 days, the grid was widened. A second ground team was brought in, this one with 2 specially trained search dogs, a yellow Labrador named Kino and a Belgian Malinois named Trace, both with the Alaska Search and Rescue Dogs Volunteer Organization. The dogs worked the terrain between the bare canister location and the upper ridgeline for 11 hours on September 12th and produced no alert. The aerial assets flew a combined 47 sorties over 6 days, covering an area of approximately 380 square miles. The FLIR units detected no heat signatures consistent with a living human being in the primary search zone. On September 15th, a storm system moved in from the Gulf of Alaska with more force than the forecast had indicated. The ceiling dropped to ground level in the upper drainages, grounding all aviation assets. Winds at elevation reached 55 miles per hour. The temperature at the Kennecott weather station dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight, and the forecast showed no improvement for at least 72 hours. Franklin Becht convened a scaled-back operations briefing at 7 o'clock in the morning on September 16th. He laid out the numbers plainly. They had been searching for 6 days. They had covered more than 380 square miles. They had found 1 piece of physical evidence. The subject had been missing for a week in terrain where temperatures were already below freezing at night and dropping further. Statistical survival probability for an uninjured subject with adequate equipment was still meaningful at this point but declining with every additional day. At no point in the briefing did Becht use the word dead. He used the word unavailable. He said Daniel Hargrove had become unavailable to their current search methods in terrain that was effectively inaccessible under present conditions. He said the search would be maintained at a reduced level, aerial overflight when weather permitted, a standing request to any pilots or hunters operating in the region to report any observations, but that the primary operational search was being scaled back. He delivered this information to Ellen Hargrove in person at 9 o'clock in the morning, in the same maintenance office where they had first met. She listened. She asked 3 questions. What does scaled back mean in practice? What is the protocol for reassigning the case? And what does she need to do to keep it active? He answered all 3 questions honestly. She thanked him, shook his hand, and drove herself and Carolyn back to Anchorage in the gray September rain, following the Glen Highway west, while the mountains she had just left disappeared behind her in the clouds. The official case status as of September 16, 2014 was missing person, active, search operations suspended pending improved conditions and new information. In practice, the men and women who managed missing person statistics in Alaska knew that cases like this one piece of evidence, no body, no witnesses, one remote drainage in the largest park in the country, were rarely resolved. They were archived. They accumulated paper, and they waited. The case number was AST-2014-WC-0937. It sat in a drawer for 10 months. The first autumn without Daniel was the one that Ellen Hargrove remembered most clearly in the years that followed, because it was the season in which she had to learn to live inside a state of uncertainty that the English language did not have an adequate word for. Grief requires a body. Grief requires a certificate, a funeral, a box of belongings returned in a brown paper bag. What Ellen had was not grief. It was suspension. The particular hell of not knowing whether the person you loved was suffering or dead, or somewhere beyond either, in some condition that she could not name or imagine or prepare for. She returned to work in October. She moved through her days at the pediatric therapy clinic on Demon Boulevard with the mechanical competence of someone who has learned to separate the functioning body from the absent mind, a skill she had not known she possessed and did not want. Her colleagues were kind. They did not press her. They asked sometimes, with careful softness, how she was doing, and she gave them the answer that made them most comfortable. She was managing. She was taking it one day at a time. Yes, the search was still technically open. Yes, there had been no new information. Marcus Hargrove, Daniel's younger brother, drove down from Fairbanks 3 times in the first 2 months and sat in the kitchen of the house on Lake Otis Parkway and drank coffee and talked about Daniel with the particular earnestness of a younger sibling who has only recently realized how much he relied on the older one. Marcus was 29, a diesel mechanic, broad-shouldered and loud in company but quiet when it mattered. He had taught Daniel to read topographic maps in their father's living room when Daniel was 17, and Marcus was 12, spreading the USGS sheets across the carpet and running his finger along the contour lines while their father watched football in the next room. The maps had been their father's, a former Army surveyor who had died of a heart attack in 2008. Marcus kept his own map of the Skolai corridor pinned to the wall above his workbench in Fairbanks. In the evenings, when the shop was closed and the other mechanics had gone home, he would stand at that map and trace routes with his finger, following water downstream from the last known position, identifying possible shelter locations, working through the terrain logic of where a man following a drainage would eventually arrive. He contacted the Alaska Department of Public Safety 3 times in the first 6 months, calls that were logged, answered politely, and that produced no new action because there was no new information to act on. In February of 2015, Ellen hired a private investigator named Robert Okafor, a former Anchorage police detective with an unapologetic preference for spreadsheets and a habit of clicking his pen when he was thinking. Okafor reviewed the case file, interviewed Ranger Donna Akatsu, and Incident Commander Franklin Becht obtained the raw GPS tracking data from the InReach device, and spent 6 weeks building what he called a probability map, a model of the terrain, the weather, and the behavioral patterns of experienced backcountry travelers who become lost, overlaid with Daniel's known equipment inventory and fitness level. He presented his findings to Ellen in a binder that contained 48 pages of analysis and one central conclusion. Daniel Hargrove, if alive, had almost certainly traveled east or northeast following the Skolai drainage toward its confluence with the Nizina River system. If he had sustained an injury, a fall, a river crossing gone wrong, the most probable zone of incapacitation was within a 20-square-mile area on the interior side of the pass, in terrain that was accessible only by aircraft or by a multi-day foot journey from the nearest road. Okafor also noted in the second-to-last paragraph of his report that the absence of any trace of Daniel in an area that had been systematically searched by aviation assets with thermal imaging suggested one of 3 things. First, Daniel had been incapacitated in a location obscured from aerial view, a dense tree canopy, a canyon bottom, an overhang. Second, Daniel had traveled beyond the primary search zone before becoming incapacitated. Third, Daniel was no longer alive, by the time the FLIR searches were conducted, and his body temperature had dropped to ambient, rendering him invisible to thermal detection. Ellen read the third option 3 times. She put the binder on the coffee table and sat with it in the dark for a long time. The seasons turned. The Alaska winter came down in November and made everything inaccessible, and the mountains were locked away under storm systems, and the light failed early, and the cold deepened until it was not merely cold, but architectural, a cold that had weight and dimension and that altered the shape of everything it touched. Ellen shoveled the driveway. She filed Daniel's tax return jointly, as she was still legally entitled to do. She did not redecorate his study. She did not remove the broken-in pair of La Sportiva trail runners he had left by the back door. She did not cancel his subscription to the American Alpine Journal, which arrived in the mailbox every 2 months and which she stacked in a pile on his desk without opening. The public attention, such as it had been, faded faster than she expected. There had been a story in the Anchorage Daily News in September 2014, engineer missing after solo trip into Wrangell-St. Elias, and a follow-up in October when the search was formally scaled back. The Alaska Dispatch News ran a longer piece in November that included a photograph of Daniel from a hiking trip in the Talkeetna Mountains the year before, his face turned toward the camera, caught mid-laugh. The comments section was full of people who had never been to Alaska speculating about what had happened. She did not read the comments. By spring of 2015, Daniel Hargrove was no longer news. He was a case number in a state database, and a pinned map on a mechanic's wall in Fairbanks, and a pair of trail runners by a back door in Anchorage. The summer of 2015 passed. It was a dry summer in the Wrangell region, abnormally warm, and the rivers ran lower than usual. The autumn came again with its particular Alaskan clarity, the light going amber and horizontal, and the mountains going from green to rust to white in a sequence that happened every year regardless of who was there to see it. Ellen began keeping a journal in October 2015, more than a year after Daniel disappeared. She wrote in it most evenings, at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea. She did not write about her feelings, which surprised her. She wrote facts. She wrote down everything she could remember about Daniel, not the grand narrative of their life together, but the granular, specific details that she was afraid she would begin to lose. The way he organized his gear on the living room floor, laying it all out so he could see it before packing it into the bag. The precise temperature at which he preferred his coffee, which was not quite hot. The particular silence he had when he was concentrating on something. The way he said her name when he came in the door at the end of the day, calling it out before he had even taken off his jacket, as if establishing a location fix. She wrote these things down because she did not know whether she was writing a record of the living or a memorial for the dead. The uncertainty of that was the worst thing of all. Worse than grief would have been, she thought. Grief has a direction. Uncertainty just spins. On March 3, 2015, the Alaska State Troopers formally reclassified the case from missing person, active, to missing person, inactive. The change was administrative and conveyed no new information and required no action on anyone's part. Garrett Foss, the ranger who had taken Ellen's first call in September 2014, learned of the reclassification by email and sat with it for a moment before closing the message. He had been thinking about the case, off and on, for 6 months, thinking about the bear canister, about the 3 words on the torn moleskin page, about the quality of morning light in the Skolai corridor, and what a man following water northeast would have seen from the ridgeline above the Nizina. He printed the email out and put it in a folder and filed it in the cabinet beside his desk and went back to work. The file sat there for 7 more months. Then, at 6:12 in the morning on August 3, 2016, everything changed. The float plane belonged to a bush pilot named Cecil Ingram, 56 years old, who had been flying the Wrangell backcountry out of his operation in Kaitina for 23 years. He was a large, unhurried man who flew a 1978 de Havilland Beaver with an engine he had rebuilt himself, and who carried in the plane's cargo bay, at all times, a red emergency bag that contained a first aid kit, 2 emergency bivouac shelters, a liter of whiskey, and what he described as a functional quantity of dried moose jerky. He had made emergency landings with injured hunters 4 times in his career and had delivered 1 baby in a gravel bar near the Kaitina River confluence in 2007, a fact that appeared as the second line of his brief biography on his company's website, and which he had never been fully comfortable with as a marketing point. On the morning of August 3, 2016, Cecil Ingram was flying a solo route between Kaitina and an unnamed hunting camp in the upper Nizina Valley, carrying 200 pounds of resupply cargo for a guided bear hunt that would begin the following week. He was flying at approximately 800 feet above ground level, following the Nizina River drainage northeast through terrain that, in the summer light at that elevation, had a pastoral quality entirely at odds with its brutality. The river a braided silver thread through the wide gravel floodplain, the valley walls rising on both sides in dark spruce, and then bare rock, and then snow. At 6:12 in the morning, he saw something on a gravel bar on the east side of the Nizina, approximately 18 miles northeast of the McCarthy trailhead. He passed it without stopping. In the mirror, which gave him an oblique view of what he had passed, it resolved into something he did not want to think too carefully about at altitude. He completed another mile of flight, then turned the beaver in a wide, slow arc and came back around. He made a low pass at 200 feet. It was a person, or something that had once been a person and still was, barely. A figure prone on the gravel bar, face down, one arm extended, the other curled beneath the body. The clothing was in tatters, a base layer that might have once been blue, pants that might have once been olive drab, both so shredded and faded and dirt-caked that they had become essentially a single color, which was the gray-brown of the gravel bar itself. The figure did not move on the first pass. On the second pass, lower still, something moved. An arm, the extended one, lifting slightly and then falling. Cecil Ingram landed the beaver on the gravel bar. He would describe the next 4 minutes in an interview with the Anchorage Daily News 6 weeks later as the hardest 4 minutes of his working life, which was a statement of considerable weight from a man who had once landed in a whiteout on a glacier to retrieve a hunter with a broken femur. He crossed the gravel bar at a fast walk, then a run, and crouched down beside the figure and turned it over carefully. And what he found beneath the layers of disintegrated clothing and matted hair and skin so weathered and damaged it had cracked in multiple places, what he found was a man who was alive. The man was looking up at him. The eyes were open. They were brown. A detail Cecil Ingram could not explain why he remembered, but he did, precisely and permanently. They were brown, and they were looking up at him with an expression that was not relief and was not fear, but was something much more fundamental and much harder to name. The expression of a person who has been operating for so long in a reality stripped of other human beings that the presence of another face is almost disorienting. The man's lips were moving. Cecil leaned close to hear. "I followed the water," the man said. His voice was the consistency of gravel, dry and abraded, and barely there. "I told them, I wrote it down." Cecil Ingram placed his hand on the man's chest and felt the heartbeat, which was shallow and irregular and fast. The man's body temperature, measured with the emergency thermometer from the red bag, read 92.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Severe hypothermia, even in August, because the man was soaking wet from the river, and the nights in the Wrangell backcountry dropped below 35 degrees even in high summer. His hands were deformed, not broken, but contracted. The fingers curled inward with the particular rigidity of long-term cold injury. 3 fingers on his left hand had gone white and hard at the tips, the unmistakable presentation of third-degree frostbite, though they had clearly been that way for months and had never received treatment. Cecil Ingram sat back on his heels and looked at this man, this person who was alive when by every statistical measure he should not be, and did what he always did when a situation exceeded his existing categories of experience. He got to work. He retrieved the emergency bivouac shelter from the red bag and wrapped it around the man. He retrieved the whiskey and held it to the man's lips, and the man took 2 small swallows without choking. He activated his handheld satellite communicator and transmitted an emergency SOS with Jeep's coordinates to the Rescue Coordination Center at JBER. Then he sat beside the man on the gravel bar in the morning light and said, "What's your name?" A pause. The man's eyes moved to the sky, then back to Cecil's face. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Hargrove." Cecil Ingram already knew the name. He had read the story in the paper in September 2014. It lived in the back of his mind, the way most stories of people who go into the Wrangell backcountry and don't come out live in the minds of the people who work those mountains, as a cautionary weight, a name attached to a face, attached to a set of conditions that could theoretically happen to anyone. "Daniel," Cecil said, "you've been missing for a while." The man on the gravel bar closed his eyes. "I know," he said. "I know how long." The Alaska Air National Guard HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter from the 210th Rescue Squadron at Coulis Air National Guard Base arrived over the gravel bar at 7:48 in the morning, 1 hour and 36 minutes after Cecil Ingram's SOS transmission. The crew on board included a flight medic named Sergeant Thomas Reyes, who had deployed to Afghanistan twice and who had performed more field extractions than he could accurately count, and who stepped off the helicopter onto the gravel bar and knelt beside Daniel Hargrove and immediately, professionally, began the assessment protocol that would save his life. Reyes later documented the initial field assessment in his after-action report. Patient presented in extremis. Core temperature 92.1 degrees Fahrenheit on arrival. BP 78/52, pulse 94 irregular. Severe malnutrition, estimated body weight loss 35 to 40% from reported normal. Bilateral frostbite injuries, left hand digits 1 to 3, right foot digits 2 to 4. Multiple lacerations in varied stages of healing. Significant muscle wasting in both lower extremities, consistent with prolonged immobilization, alternating with extreme physical exertion. Patient was conscious and oriented to person and place. Emotional affect appeared flat with episodic agitation. Reyes stabilized the IV line, began active warming with chemical heat packs placed in the axillary, groin, and neck regions, and had Daniel Hargrove loaded onto the helicopter's litter in 9 minutes. As the Pavehawk lifted off the gravel bar and banked south toward Anchorage, Daniel Hargrove reached up and gripped Reyes's wrist with his undamaged right hand. His grip, despite everything, was fierce. "Ellen," Daniel said. "Call Ellen." "We will," Reyes said. "We're calling everyone." The helicopter landed at the Providence, Alaska Medical Center Trauma Bay in Anchorage at 9:17 in the morning. The trauma team that received Daniel Hargrove included Dr. Christine Park, a trauma attending with 15 years of emergency medicine experience, who would later describe his condition in a medical conference presentation as a clinical picture unlike anything I had seen outside of textbook descriptions of Second World War POW survivors. His body, she said, had undergone a systematic shutdown and partial recovery, and then another shutdown and partial recovery over a period of nearly 12 months, alternating between periods of extreme metabolic stress and periods of relative stability in which the body had, with extraordinary stubbornness, refused to die. His core temperature was brought up over the course of 6 hours using warm IV fluids, active external warming, and at one point, warmed humidified oxygen delivered through a high-flow mask. The frostbitten digits were assessed, wrapped, and scheduled for surgical consultation. He received blood transfusions and parenteral nutrition. He was moved to the ICU at 4:30 in the afternoon. At 10:42 in the morning, a chaplain's assistant had gone to find Ellen Hargrove. She had been at work. She was in the middle of a session with a 7-year-old boy with sensory processing disorder when her cell phone buzzed with a number she did not recognize. She silenced it. It buzzed again. She excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. "Mrs. Hargrove," said the voice on the line, "my name is Sergeant Thomas Reyes with the Alaska Air National Guard. I want you to know that your husband is alive. He is on his way to Providence Medical Center in Anchorage right now. He is in serious condition, but he is alive." She put her hand against the wall. "Say that again," she said. He said it again. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor of the clinic hallway with her back against the baseboard and her knees drawn up and her phone pressed against her ear, and she did not cry, which she would later describe as the single strangest thing about that morning. She did not cry. She said very quietly, "He's been gone 341 days. "Yes, ma'am," Sergeant Reyes said. "I know." The investigation that followed Daniel Hargrove's recovery was not a criminal investigation. Not initially. It was a survival analysis conducted jointly by the National Park Service and the Alaska Department of Public Safety, with contributions from the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group and the Providence, Alaska Medical Center's trauma and surgical teams. Its purpose was to understand how a man had survived nearly a year in the Wrangell-St. Elias backcountry without resupply, communication, or rescue, and whether the sequence of events that had led to that survival contained any elements that were the result of another person's actions or decisions. The answer to that second question was complicated. Daniel Hargrove spent 11 days in the Providence ICU before he was stable enough for extended interviews. During that period, he was visited daily by Ellen, who sat in the chair beside his bed and held his right hand, the undamaged one, and did not ask him questions he wasn't ready to answer. Marcus drove down from Fairbanks and sat in the waiting room for 3 days before Daniel was well enough to see him. And when Marcus finally walked into the room and saw what his brother had become, the weight loss, the contracted hands, the skin scored with the pale tracks of old wounds, he walked back out into the hallway and leaned against the wall for 2 full minutes before he was able to go back in. The story Daniel Hargrove told his investigators, first to Detective Sergeant Linda Thorvaldson of the Alaska State Troopers, then to Ranger Donna Akatsu, who had found his bare canister 2 years earlier and who sat across from him in the hospital conference room with the same geological calm she brought to everything, was one of the most complex survival narratives any of the investigators had encountered in their professional careers. It began where the Jeep's tracking had ended. On the afternoon of Sunday, September 7, 2014, at approximately 11 in the morning, Daniel Hargrove had been crossing a tributary of the upper Nizina drainage on the interior side of Skolai Pass when the footing gave way on a wet boulder and he went into the water. The crossing was not deep, perhaps 18 inches at the deepest, but the current was faster than it appeared, fed by several days of late summer glacial melt from higher up, and the temperature of the water was approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He went under completely, came up 10 feet downstream, and managed to haul himself onto the far bank, where he sat in the wind at 3,400 feet of elevation, soaking wet in 41-degree ambient air. His pack had stayed on. This was the first piece of luck, or preparation, or both, that determined everything that followed. The pack stayed on because he had learned to clip his sternum strap and hip belt before any water crossing, a habit drilled into him by Marcus when they were teenagers. The dry bags inside the pack had kept his sleeping bag dry. The tent was wet on its exterior, but the packed components inside the stuff sack were usable. His fire-starting kit, the petroleum jelly cotton balls in their Ziploc bag, was intact. He built a fire. This took 22 minutes by his reckoning, his hands already losing dexterity from the cold, using a boulder overhang as a windbreak and working through 3 cotton balls before the sticks caught. He stripped and dried his base layers over the fire and spent 3 hours getting his core temperature back to functional. What he had not noticed until the fire was going and he was beginning to warm was that his inReach satellite communicator, which had been clipped to the outside of his pack's shoulder strap for easy access, was gone. The carabiner clip was still there. The device was not. He searched the bank for 40 minutes. He did not find it. The river had taken it, and with it, his only reliable means of communicating his position to anyone. He had his cell phone, which had no service. He had his map and compass. He had his whistle. He had everything else. The decision that defined the next 11 months was made at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on September 7, 2014, on a tundra bench above the Nizina drainage and terrain that the topographic map showed as solid, but that the actual ground disagreed with in every particular detail. Daniel Hargrove looked at his map and looked at the sky, which was starting to build the convective clouds that Ranger Wells had warned him about, exactly as she had predicted, and made a calculation. He was 5.8 miles from the trailhead. The route back required recrossing the same drainage he had just fallen into, plus 2 more crossings of comparable rivers higher up. The weather was deteriorating. He was already behind schedule. His tent and sleeping bag were functional. He had 2 days of food and a functioning fire kit. The calculation he made was, go forward, not back. The Nizina River, if followed northeast, would take him approximately 20 miles to the confluence with the Kaitina River Valley, where there were seasonal hunting cabins. He had seen them on the map, marked as emergency use in the park's backcountry guide, and where a bush plane looking for a stranded hunter was infinitely more likely to find him than in the upper Skolai drainage. Followed the water. He wrote it on the torn page of his field journal, placed it inside the bare canister with the remaining food, and left the canister where it could be found. He did not know whether anyone would find it. He left it because it was the only communication option he had, and because the methodical part of his brain, the engineering part that built structures out of facts, could not accept the alternative of leaving nothing. He walked northeast. For the first 3 days, his situation was inconvenient rather than catastrophic. He moved well, covered ground, found his way down to the Nizina floodplain, identified the hunting cabin he had seen on the map, a 12 by 14-foot trapper's structure with plywood walls, a corrugated tin roof, a rusted wood stove, and a cache of dry firewood inside that he later estimated had saved his life more than anything else he had done or decided. He arrived at the cabin at dusk on September 9th, the same evening that Garrett Foss was filing the overdue person report in Copper Center, the same evening that Ellen was sitting in the kitchen, looking at the InReach tracking history and trying not to catastrophize. He spent 3 nights at the cabin, drying his equipment, rationing his food, cutting additional firewood, and waiting for a plane. No plane came. The weather that moved in on September 14th, the same storm that grounded the NPS search aviation assets, hit the Nizina Valley with ferocity, dropping 18 inches of snow at 2,000 feet elevation and coating the surrounding terrain in a wet, heavy layer that brought temperatures down to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by the second night of the storm. On the 4th morning after the storm, he took stock of his situation with the clinical detachment he would later describe as his most useful survival tool, the ability to look at circumstances without sentimentality. He had food for approximately 8 more days at reduced rationing. He had the cabin and its wood stove. He had no communication and no reliable expectation of rescue before the weather closed in for winter. He understood with the clarity of someone who has just run out of comfortable interpretive options, in serious trouble. What followed was a case study in adaptive improvisation that the investigators later described, in their formal report, as exceeding the survival performance parameters applied in standard training scenarios. Over the course of September and October 2014, Daniel Hargrove systematically expanded his capacity to survive the approaching winter. He cut and stacked firewood. He constructed a snare system using paracord and the wire from the cabin's rusted mosquito screen, targeting the snowshoe hare and ptarmigan populations that moved through the valley. He built a cache system to store frozen meat above the snow line and out of reach of wolverines, which he encountered twice near the cabin, and which he described to investigators as genuinely unpleasant and surprisingly large. He cut spruce boughs to improve the cabin's insulation, packing them into the gaps in the plywood walls. He melted snow for water, boiling it in the cabin's single surviving pot. The frostbite on his left hand occurred on October the 23rd, 2014, during a woodcutting session in which the temperature dropped precipitously while he was away from the cabin. He recognized the whitening of the fingertips immediately and returned to the cabin and re-warmed them slowly. The correct protocol, which he knew from the wilderness first aid certification he had completed 4 years earlier. The damage was permanent nonetheless. The tissue had already been compromised beyond recovery. He kept a journal. He had salvaged 3 pages from his field journal. The rest had gone into the river with the InReach, and he wrote on both sides of each page in the smallest handwriting he could manage, using the short stub of pencil that lived in the journal's spiral binding. He numbered the days. He wrote down the temperature, estimated by how quickly water froze in the cabin. He wrote down what he had eaten. He wrote down observations about the terrain and the animal behavior and the weather. He wrote down, in a section he marked off with a line and labeled simply with her name, things he wanted to tell Ellen. The investigators read those pages in the hospital conference room with the door closed, and then they gave them back to him without discussing them, because they belonged to him and not to the investigation. The winter was the hardest thing any of them had ever tried to imagine. Temperatures in the Nizina Valley interior dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit on 3 separate occasions in February, by Daniel's account. The wood stove was the difference between life and death on those nights. The single corrugated tin pipe venting through the roof, the orange glow through the stove's cracked door, the smell of burning spruce resin in the small, dark space. He trapped consistently through December and January, but the ptarmigan population crashed in February, a natural cycle, and for 3 weeks, He survived primarily on thin broth made from old bones and whatever dried lichen he could scrape from the rocks. When the temperature permitted brief trips outside, he lost the 4 toes on his right foot in stages throughout the winter. Not catastrophically, but gradually, the tissue dying by degrees. The pain coming and going in cycles, he learned to manage through stillness and cold packs made from snow in a folded cloth. He did not amputate them. He did not have the means or the knowledge to perform a field amputation safely, and the tissue, though dead, was not infected. And he made the judgment call, the engineering calculation, Ellen would say later, to leave them in place and deal with the medical consequences of that decision when and if he ever reached a hospital. He was still there when spring came. He was still there when the birds returned in late April and the snowmelt began and the Nizina floodplain opened up again in the long, disorienting light of the Alaskan spring. He was 40 pounds lighter than he had been on September 6th. He had a beard that reached his collarbone. His clothes were in the condition Cecil Ingram found them in. His hands were damaged, and his right foot was damaged, and his body had been so thoroughly depleted and rebuilt on whatever it could find that his muscle mass, when measured at the hospital, was 34% below his pre-disappearance baseline. But he was alive. He began moving toward the Nizina confluence in late May, walking slowly. His right foot made speed impossible, and using a spruce pole as a staff, he moved 3 to 5 miles a day when the terrain permitted. He camped along the river and trapped and foraged as he went. He was nearly at the confluence when his strength gave out entirely in mid-July, and he was forced to stop for 2 weeks on a gravel bar, unable to continue, too exhausted to do anything but lie in his shelter and wait. It was during this second immobility period, in late July, that his core temperature dropped again. The ambient August nights combined with his depleted reserves and his immobility producing a hypothermic state that was slower and more insidious than the acute hypothermia of a river crossing. He was in a state of moderate hypothermia when Cecil Ingram's float plane passed over the gravel bar on the morning of August 3rd. The investigators determined that the sequence of decisions Daniel Hargrove had made, from the choice to follow water northeast rather than attempt the river crossings on a deteriorating day, to the leaving of the note in the bear canister, to the construction of the winter camp in the emergency cabin, to the specific, repetitive disciplines of trapping and firewood and journal keeping that had given his day's structure, when structure was the only thing standing between him and psychological collapse, constituted a response to an extreme survival situation that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. They also determined that no other person was involved. This was important. In the early days of the investigation, Detective Sergeant Thorvaldsen had pursued several lines of inquiry, suggesting that Daniel might have had assistance from someone in the backcountry, a hunter, a trapper, an off-grid resident, whose involvement might have had legal implications. Those lines of inquiry all went cold. There were no witnesses. There was no physical evidence of another person at the emergency cabin site. There was no financial or behavioral record consistent with anyone having known where Daniel Hargrove was while the search was ongoing. He had survived alone. This was the conclusion. It was also, somehow, the most incomprehensible part of the whole story. In the weeks after Daniel's return, the investigators and the medical team and the journalists who would eventually write about the case all asked variations of the same question. What kept you going? The question was understandable. It was also, Daniel Hargrove found, almost impossible to answer in a way that didn't sound either reductive or grandiose. The winter was not a spiritual experience. The cold was not character building. The hunger was not an opportunity for self-discovery. It was terrible in a very plain, physical way. And he endured it because the alternative was not enduring it, and he was not ready for that alternative. I kept a list, he told Ellen one evening in the hospital, 3 days before he was discharged. He was sitting up in bed, eating solid food for the first time with any confidence. Every morning I wrote down 3 things. One thing I was going to do that day, one thing I was going to think about, one thing I was grateful for. What did you write down? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. For the first one, it was always firewood or traps, or something practical. For the second one, it was usually the Talkeetna trip, or the kitchen at home, or your face in the morning before you've had your coffee. He paused. For the third one, The thing I was grateful for, it was always the same thing, every single day. What was it? That you would still be looking? He said. She had been looking. She had never stopped looking. And that, investigators and doctors and journalists and people who followed the story in the papers and online would spend years trying to understand that human capacity for tethering oneself to an absent person across an abyss of uncertainty, keeping the tether taut, refusing to let it go, was perhaps the most remarkable survival element in the entire story. And it belonged not to Daniel Hargrove, but to Ellen. There was no trial. There was no perpetrator. There was no locked room, no criminal conspiracy, no hidden machinery of harm to dismantle in a courtroom. This was, in its way, both the simplest and the most disorienting aspect of the Hargrove case. There was no villain to blame, and therefore no resolution of the kind that the human mind tends to seek when something terrible happens. The wilderness was not culpable. The river was not culpable. The storm that had moved in from the Gulf of Alaska was not culpable. The lost inReach was not culpable. The sequence of events that had placed Daniel Hargrove on a gravel bar in the Wrangell-St. Elias backcountry, alone and unable to communicate, was not the result of any human malice. It was the result of a threshold moment, one wet boulder in one river crossing on one afternoon, that had tipped a routine adventure into an 11-month ordeal. The National Park Service conducted an internal after-action review of the 2014 search operation, completed in November 2016. The review, authored by a 3-person panel that included Franklin Becht, found that the search had been conducted in compliance with all applicable protocols and that the outcome was not the result of any operational error. The review recommended several procedural adjustments: expanded use of inReach device backup protocols when issuing backcountry permits to solo travelers, increased frequency of aerial coverage in the first 72 hours following a missed check-in, and the development of a more detailed emergency cabin inventory and location system for the park's interior. These recommendations were incorporated into the park's backcountry safety program by January 2017. Ranger Donna Akatsu, who had found the bear canister in 2014 and had sat across from Daniel Hargrove in the hospital conference room in 2016, was promoted to backcountry safety coordinator for the park's southern district in 2017. She kept a copy of the bear canister photograph, the one she had taken in the field on September 11, 2014, showing the canister lodged between 2 boulders with the torn blue moleskin page visible inside it, pinned to the corkboard above her desk in the Kennecott Ranger Station. She did not explain it to people who asked. She didn't need to. Sergeant Thomas Reyes, the flight medic who had stabilized Daniel Hargrove on the gravel bar, continued flying rescue operations with the 210th Rescue Squadron. He wrote a brief account of the extraction for his unit's internal newsletter in October 2016, and in it he described the moment he arrived at the patient's position on the gravel bar as the most clarifying moment of my career to date, a reminder of what the biological machine is capable of when it is sufficiently motivated. He did not elaborate on what motivated meant in that context. He did not need to. Cecil Ingram, the bush pilot who had spotted Daniel Hargrove from 200 feet and landed on the gravel bar, continued operating his charter flight business out of Chitina. He was interviewed by 7 separate media outlets in the 6 weeks following Daniel's recovery, each of which wanted him to describe the moment of discovery in cinematic terms that he consistently declined to provide. His standard answer was that he had seen something on the bar that looked wrong, and he had turned around to check it out. That was what you did. You turned around. He did not see why this required elaboration. The medical team at Providence, Alaska Medical Center published a case report on Daniel Hargrove's recovery, identifying him only as a 34-year-old male with prolonged wilderness exposure. In the Journal of Emergency Medicine, in March 2017, the report described his clinical course, his surgical outcomes, and the rehabilitation protocol that had been developed for his case. The 3 frostbitten fingers on his left hand were amputated to the first knuckle in a procedure performed 4 weeks after his admission. The 4 toes on his right foot were debrided and partially amputated in 2 separate procedures. He retained enough function in both the hand and the foot for walking and for most daily tasks, though he would never again achieve the speed and dexterity that had made him a capable backcountry traveler. He underwent physical therapy for 14 months. His weight returned to within 7 pounds of his pre-disappearance baseline by January 2017. His muscle mass required longer. The rebuilding of lean tissue at the cellular level proceeds at its own pace and does not respond to effort or urgency in any straightforward way. He experienced significant episodes of what his psychiatrist, Dr. Anita Osei, described in her clinical notes as post-survival adjustment disorder, a syndrome that shared characteristics with PTSD, but was distinguished by its specific trigger profile. Not the recollection of trauma, but the re-encounter with ordinary life, the warmth of a room, the smell of food, the sound of other people moving through a house. These things undid him initially, in ways that combat veterans and abuse survivors sometimes describe. The body interpreting safety as suspicious, the nervous system unable to downshift from the vigilance it had required to stay alive for 11 months. He did not hide this. He attended his appointments with Dr. Osei twice a week for the first 6 months and then weekly for the following 18 months. He was, she noted in her case summary, an unusually cooperative patient, someone who approached his own psychological recovery with the same systematic thoroughness he had apparently applied to his physical survival, which was both an asset and a challenge, because not everything that needs healing can be repaired through a checklist. He began speaking publicly about his experience in the fall of 2017, more than a year after his recovery, after declining every media request during the period of his physical rehabilitation. His first public appearance was a presentation at the annual Alaska Search and Rescue Conference in Anchorage, where he spoke for 40 minutes to an audience of rangers, rescue professionals, and volunteers, the people who do this work, who go into the field looking for the ones who don't come back. He did not give the presentation to celebrate his survival. He gave it because the people in that room needed to know what their work meant, even in cases that appeared, by every operational measure, to have ended in failure. "You found the canister?" he said near the end of the presentation, looking at Donna Akatsu in the second row. "I knew that if you found the canister, you would know which way I went. I knew that. And knowing that you knew that someone was reading the same map I was reading, that was not nothing. That kept me moving on days when I would not otherwise have moved." The room was very quiet. Robert Okafor, the private investigator Ellen had hired in February 2015, attended the conference as a guest. He had driven himself down from his office on Northern Lights Boulevard and sat in the back row in a gray blazer and listened to the presentation with his pen turning slowly between his fingers, not clicking, which was unusual for him. Afterward, in the hallway, he shook Daniel's hand and said nothing. Daniel thanked him for the probability map, the 48 pages of analysis that had sent search resources looking in the right general direction, even if the right exact direction had been further and longer than anyone had calculated. Okafor shook his head. "I just put the math on paper," he said. "You did the work." The Hargroves remained in Anchorage. Ellen returned to her practice at the pediatric therapy clinic, where she worked 2 days a week through Daniel's recovery and then returned to full-time in the spring of 2017. Daniel did not return to the structural engineering firm. His rehabilitation schedule made the standard working hours unworkable for the first 2 years, and by the time he was physically able to return, he had discovered that he no longer wanted to sit at a desk and perform calculations about load-bearing capacities in the abstract. He enrolled in an outdoor education certification program in 2018 and became a wilderness survival instructor, contracting initially with the Alaska Mountain Wilderness Classic organization and later with the National Outdoor Leadership School's Alaska campus. He taught wilderness first aid, backcountry navigation, and, most requested, survival decision-making. The specific, granular skill of reading a deteriorating situation and making the correct call before the situation has finished deteriorating. He taught these courses with a methodology that his students consistently described as neither dramatic nor clinical, but something rarer and more useful, honest. He did not romanticize what had happened to him. He did not present his survival as proof of anything about himself as a person. He presented it as a sequence of decisions, most of them small, made in the specific context of adequate preparation and extraordinary misfortune. And he was careful to point out, always, in every course, that adequate preparation had not saved him from the misfortune. It had only given him enough margin to survive it. In his courses, he kept on a shelf at the front of the classroom a single object, a beat-up carabiner with an empty attachment loop where an in-reach device should have been clipped. He did not explain it. Students asked sometimes. He told them to clip their satellite communicators to their pack hip belts, not their shoulder straps. He told them to use a backup tether. He told them that a 10-second piece of redundancy, a simple loop of cord attached to a clip, was the difference between a story that ends badly and a story that ends at all. He never took another solo backcountry trip. This was not a decision he made in a hospital bed or in a therapist's office. It was a decision that made itself over the course of time, the way some truths do, gradually and without announcement. He hiked with Ellen, he hiked with Marcus, he hiked with groups of students. The wilderness was not frightening to him. It was not even different in any meaningful way from what it had always been. It was large and cold and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful. It had not tried to kill him. It had simply been exactly what it had always been, and he had walked into it alone and gotten to the point where he had to choose whether to keep going. And he had kept going, and here he was. In the fall of 2018, 4 years after his disappearance and 2 years after his return, Ellen Hargrove began writing a book. She did not write about Daniel's survival, which was his story to tell or not tell, as he chose. She wrote about the 341 days she had spent not knowing, about the specific cognitive and emotional mechanics of living in irreducible uncertainty, the way the mind learns to hold two irreconcilable truths at once and continue functioning. She was not a writer. She said this in the acknowledgments of the book, which was published in January 2020 under the title The Tether, and she said it as a fact rather than an apology. She was a therapist. She wrote the way therapists think, in process, in observation, in the careful, respectful attention to what was actually happening rather than what she wished were happening. The book's final chapter was short. It described a hike she and Daniel had taken the previous summer in the Talkeetna Mountains, a 2-day loop they had done before his disappearance, familiar terrain, the kind of place you go when you want to be somewhere beautiful without anything to prove. They had camped on a ridge above tree line, and in the evening, with the light coming from the northwest, at that particular Alaskan angle that made everything look as though it were being seen for the first time, she had watched Daniel sit at the edge of the camp and look out at the mountains. He was doing nothing. He was not checking his gear or consulting a map or building a fire. He was sitting with his damaged hand resting on his knee and his eyes moving slowly across the terrain, not anxiously, not with the hypervigilance she had watched him work through in therapy, but with a quality of attention she could only describe as tenderness. She did not disturb him. She sat behind him and watched him watch the mountains and thought about the quality of that attention, the specific love it represented, which was not a love of danger or of hardship or of proving something, but a love of the actual world in its actual dimensions, cold, large, indifferent, and extraordinary. The love of someone who has been inside the thing and come back out, and still, with full knowledge of what it contains, finds it worth looking at. In the evidence log for case AST 2014-WC-0937, the torn moleskin page from Daniel Hargrove's field journal was entered as Item 1A, physical evidence retrieved September 11, 2014, Scolai Pass drainage. For reasons that were largely administrative, the item was never officially removed from evidence and never destroyed. It sat in a manila envelope in a file box in the Glenallen AST detachment storage room. 3 words in black pencil on blue paper, waiting in the dark, followed the water. Everything he had, everything he needed. A direction, not an answer. The oldest survival instruction in the world, written on the smallest possible piece of paper and left in a crack in the rocks of a mountain at the edge of the world, where a woman with steady hands and good eyes found it on a gray September afternoon and understood immediately that it was a message from a living person to the people who were looking for him. The case was officially closed on October 14, 2016. The status notation in the database read, "Resolved. Subject located alive." The case number was archived. The file box went to long-term storage. The pen that Garrett Foss had used to note the initial overdue report was still in the same drawer of his desk at the ranger station. He had never thrown it out, which was not something he would have been able to explain to anyone, and which he did not try to. Some things you just keep. Daniel Hargrove continues to teach wilderness survival and backcountry decision-making through the National Outdoor Leadership School's Alaska campus. He has spoken at conferences across North America on solo wilderness travel safety and the role of pre-departure communication protocols in search and rescue outcomes. Ellen Hargrove's book, The Tether, was a finalist for the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award in 2020. Cecil Ingram still flies the Wrangell backcountry out of Kaitina. He has not changed the inventory of his red emergency bag.
Follow the water. 3 words that saved a life in the wildest corner of Alaska. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like if this video moved you, and subscribe so you never miss our next story.